Hello, everyone, and welcome. While everyone is getting situated, we'll just give everyone a minute. We'll get started very soon. Wow, we are already up to over, oh my goodness, we're at over 300 folks and counting. Okay, it seems like that is slowing down, so we'll jump in and get started. So I want to welcome everyone to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Justice Conference. We are so excited to welcome new participants as well as those who were able to attend our conference last week. If you missed it, please know that most of the presentations were recorded and will be available on our conference website at a future date. My name is Jamie Goldberg, and I'm happy you are here for this breakout presentation, Abolitionist Restorative Justice, Identity, Power, and Social Transformation with Dr. Demita Brown. We would also encourage you to stick around after this presentation for our closing panel featuring Dr. Brown, Jacqueline Bogus, and Sakara Wages. We'll put a link to this panel in the chat at the end of the presentation so you can easily navigate there. Before we get started today, it is important to take a moment to honor Indigenous people by sharing our university's land acknowledgement, which I will read now. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land and a place their nation has called Tijo since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I have a few more housekeeping details for you before we jump into the content today. Please know that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. To access this presentation, you were required to provide your name and email. This allows us to log attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation. These will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted throughout the presentation. We do have the Q&A feature set up where you can submit questions for the presenter. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we are at almost 400 right now. We will not be able to get to all the questions that were submitted. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Demita Brown, and I'll tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Brown is a community-based educator and organizer who specializes in contemplative and creative approaches to racial justice and restorative justice. She holds a doctorate in history of consciousness and has taught youth who are incarcerated, as well as at the college level. Using contemplative practices, creative process work, and transformative justice, her approach addresses deep patterns of harm at the institutional, interpersonal, and personal levels. Currently, Dr. Brown serves as the Restorative Justice Director at the Dane County Time Bank. She is the lead teacher for the Abolitionist Restorative Justice Workshop and the Community Lab for Intentional Practice. In these supportive spaces, people connect and build the skills they need to practice justice. Dr. Brown, it's our honor to have you join us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. It's really good to be here. I'm I'm very pleased to be with you guys today. And I want to acknowledge ancestors, um, my ancestors whose blood and bones are in this soil, but also beyond the soil of what we consider to be the Americas, my diaspora ancestors, and my acknowledging my roots in the diaspora as an important part of the wisdom lineage from which I hail. I also want to bring the voice of Christos, a native Menominee poet, into this space. Her people are from Wisconsin, north of here, although that's just our conception of where they're from. And I want to read a poem of hers called Into the Anti-Racism Workshop. My cynical feet ambled, prepared for indigestion and blank faces of outrageous innocence. Knowing I'd have to walk over years of media declaring we're vanished or savage or pitiful or noble, my toes twitched when I saw so few brown faces. But really, when one eats racism every time one goes out one's door, the appeal of talking about it is minuscule. I sat with my back to the wall facing the door. After I changed the chairs to a circle, this doesn't really protect me, but I conned myself into believing it does. One of the first speakers piped up, "I'm only here because my friend is Black and wanted me to do this with her. I've already done 300 too many racism workshops. Let it be entered into the book of stars that I did not kill her or shoot a scathing reply from the hip. I let it pass because I could tell she was very interested in taking up all the space with herself. And I would do it if I had a word, and would do it if I said a word." They all said something that I could turn into a poem, but I got tired and went to sleep behind my interested eyes. I've learned that the most important part of these tortures is for them to speak about racism at all. Even showing up is heresy. Because as we all know, racism is some vague thing that doesn't really exist. It exists, or it's only the skinheads, or a bad day, or it isn't really a crucial problem. Not as important, certainly, as queers being able to marry or get insurance for each other. When they turned to me as a resident expert on the subject, which quite honestly, I can't for the life of me understand or make any sense of, I spoke from my feet things I didn't know I knew, of our connections, of the deadly poison that racism is for all of us. Maybe some of them were touched, but my bitch voice jumped in to say, "Not much." I heard back that someone thought I was brilliant. Does that mean that I speak well or that she is changed? It's only her change I need. So today I will be looking at the alternative spaces where knowledge is produced, the alternative ways in which the white dominant narrative is interrupted from outside of the walls of the academic setting, outside of the language and the prescribed buzzwords of a particular moment or a discipline. But to bring us back to these sites of knowledge production that are always connecting to our wisdom legacies, our ancestors, our very earthy lived experience of exploitation and domination in the United States and in the Americas and beyond. So I wanted to share Christos's poem first, and I want to invite you to experiment with me today in a less linear, more improvisational, and more experiential foray into how we can make the change that is necessary and that these times are calling on us to make. So that's a part of the ask that I'm asking you from the top, is to let go of some of the expectations about what an academic space should do, and who are the voices that we are bringing into this space. So another very important part of the knowledge base that informs what I'm sharing with you today is Black feminism. And I think that many of you have read some of the Black feminist activist scholars, organizers, who have helped to shape this discursive intervention, if you will. And I guess one of the first things I wanted to do to engage you is to ask you to name out some of those names of the people who have helped to shape Black feminist thought, activism, and social justice movements. So I'm going to ask our tech / moderator folks to help me out by opening up the Q&A for that. And when that's done, let me know. But while they're doing that, I want to ask you again, who are the Black women thinkers, activists, movement builders, people from our history that we know about who have informed Black feminist thought? And I want you guys to rack your brains, think about what you've read, think about what you're going to read, but call those names out. And I think they might show up in the chat, I'm not sure. But I could probably read them out if that's the way they'll show up. Let's see here.
They're going to show up in the Q&A.
Okay, great.
And
gotcha.
Feel free to read them out if that's easy. I can also read them out or even copy and paste them into the chat so everyone can see.
Yeah, read out the names, just the names.
Okay.
Oh, good. Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Nekima Levy Armstrong, Harriet Tubman, lots of Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, Rosa Parks, Maya Angelou, Patrice Cullors, who we had the amazing opportunity to hear from last week, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, Austin Channing Brown.
This is great.
Dorothy Roberts, Stacey Abrams, Alice Walker, Octavia Butler, Rachel Elizabeth Cargill, Bettina Love, Sojourner Truth, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Loretta Ross.
Very good.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Good job, you guys. And why do we bring these names into this space? When we are doing this work of looking at abolition, looking at the transformative practices for social work that will make it what it could be, I think it's important for us to think about interrupting institutional practices in the community of voices that have started this tradition of interrupting dominance, interrupting exclusion, interrupting white supremacist culture, interrupting racism, interrupting the places that we hide, interrupting the comfort of hiding in our fears. So we need to remember we're not alone, and our responsibility to lifting up that work and that legacy. So we want to centralize their work and their knowledge and their influence on our ability to do what we're doing today. And thank you for contributing to that. So one of the things that we want to be able to do is to understand our awareness, our relationship to awareness, consciousness, being awake. We want to be able to understand our ability to transform a worldview and where that kind of capacity comes from. So, deconstructionists grappled with the idea of a reference point and wanting to step outside of, a white male subject, a certain way of understanding the world from a certain subject position. And that required some interdisciplinary work, some breaking down the walls of what social studies is, what history is, what anthropology is, what psychoanalytic theory is, what Black history is, what is musicology. All of these different fields had to have different kinds of conversations with each other. And sometimes that meant anti-disciplinariness. You had to be willing to say, the parameters that we've been asked to fold ourselves into do not allow us the view that will accommodate this work. We want something more panoramic. As a person who was more influenced by social history, I find that willingness to challenge subject position in order to sorry about my dog, in order to hey, go lay down, go. In order to be able to look at worldviews and compare, what is it that I think I know? What are the myths, the mythologies, or the ideologies, or the hidden false truths that I am being asked to participate in and to perpetuate? And how do they connect me to institutions of privilege and power? And how do they ask me to accept and exchange a certain kind of privilege and commitment to the status quo? So without some sort of a disciplinary foundation by which to examine and compare worldviews, we can't know what we don't know, right? So we're striving as a institutional practice to create that infrastructure that allows us to know when we're blind, when we're being complicit, when we're being silent, when we don't understand. We're trying to understand our own ignorance. And what that would do is allow us to have a multidimensionality, which comes very much out of Black feminist thought. This idea of understanding compounded identities and the intersections between those identities. To understand the relationship between suffering halfway around the world and my own. To understand the imprint, the global imprint of white supremacist culture and how I practice that. What is my responsibility? How have I contributed to the imprint of white supremacist culture here and around the world? We can't take responsibility for our role in it unless we're willing to deconstruct and reimagine, rebuild a broader view. That is the abolitionist work. We have to abolish those false walls, false parameters, false subscription into identities that are actually compounding suffering and oppression and dominance. So challenging that, abolishing that, and replacing it with what? To be able to do those things, we have to know what we don't know. And that's not always easy. So I want to talk about another part of the scaffolding for my work, which is contemplative practice. And I use it, I teach workshops in the community that almost always start with some kind of contemplative practice, some kind of way of looking at and examining my own mind and what sorts of dialogues and ideologies and scripts, what kinds of norms am I subscribing to that I'm not even aware of, that might be oppressive and contributing to that oppressive imprint. And it's a way of taking stock with some sense of kindness and compassion and gentleness for my experience, knowing that I've inherited, you know, the white supremacist ideologies that inform how I live my day. So having some gentleness towards that, but also taking responsibility for not continuing to contribute to that or live in that. And we all need to build that space, which is to say, some of you are, probably do something similar. You've found ways to challenge and interrupt and transform. And this is another, you can add this one to your repertoire, or maybe you already do some form of contemplative practice. But I want to invite you in that spirit of improvisation and being experimental to let me teach you how to meditate. So since you guys are not in a position to object, I'm going to assume that since you're still here, that's a yes, you want to do this. So before we get into it, I want to tell you a little bit more about why it helps, how it helps. The personal part of this work, the becoming an ally to my own mind, really doesn't have a lot of support in the wider culture. When we think about what Western culture is about, it's about making a lot of assumptions about what we know, having a lot of aggression about knowledge, creating a lot of false hierarchies with what we think we know, and operating on autopilot based on what storylines that have been fed to us. And really what we need to do is to build more practices that allow us to slow down, settle, and connect with the wisdom lineages that we've been separated from. One of the first things that happens in professionalization, like social work, is that we're taught to rely on experts outside of ourselves. We're taught to rely on knowledge bases that come from, some pretty questionable places. Knowledge bases that are separated from the lived experiences of the people who we're expected to interact with and try to help. And really, what that does is break down our trust in our own ability and those spaces outside of the academy that should be informing our practice. So before I do this, before I teach you a technique called shamatha, I want us to watch a short video. And it is, I will ask you to watch and just not have any idea about why you're watching, but just watch because it's there. And just while you're watching, see if you can get all of your senses involved and your whole body and your whole presence there, and just watch and absorb and feel and allow yourself to hear. Okay, we're ready.
What makes a question a good question? Well, I met this woman one time, and I said, when was the last time you touched a...
We have a poem here. It's called Whitey on the Moon. And it was inspired by some whiteys on the moon. So I want to give credit where credit is due. All right. That's it. A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still while Whitey's on the moon. You know, the man just upped my rent last night, cause Whitey's on the moon. No hot water, no toilets, no lights, but Whitey's on the moon. I wonder why he's upping me, cause Whitey's on the moon? Well, I was already giving him $50 a week, and now Whitey's on the moon. Taxes taking my whole damn check. The junkies make me a nervous wreck. The price of food is going up. And as if all that crap wasn't enough, a rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. Was all that money I made last year for Whitey on the moon? How come I ain't got no money here? Whitey's on the moon. You know, I just about had my fill of Whitey on the moon. I think I'll send these doctor bills, air mail special. To Whitey on the moon.
Dr. Brown, you're muted.
Hey, thank you for that. So we're seeing a place where some of the intersections are being explored between white identity and the system of exclusion from, you know, economic viability and stability, poverty, the harm caused by, you know, the misunderstanding of resource allocation to the point where the needs of different communities are prioritized in a way that makes us look at them without enough understanding. So we're seeing Gil Scott-Heron bring our awareness to the disconnect that he is exploring there. And we want to be able to hear that and look at the way that identity is being evoked without turning off, right? Without getting defensive and fragile, and being able to understand, to stand in our responsibility. And so when we're encountering
Dr. Brown, unfortunately, you're muted again.
Oh, Ma, I don't know where I might have left off. Did you guys hear me talking about identity? Let me just rewind and go back to why. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's perfect now. Thank you.
I'm just gonna rewind, and maybe I said this already, but what we want to be able to do is to look at how identity is being invoked there, and the way it's asking us to look at the linkages between our communities and how money is allocated, right? where we're spending money on going to the moon, we're spending money on this and that. And he's pointing to white identity. He's pointing to white priorities. He's pointing to a white power structure that is separating the needs of the Black community and other communities from that priority of how money is getting spent. Whitey's on the moon. My sister got bit by a rat. Whitey's on the moon. We don't have the health care. Whitey's on the moon. So there's this implication of whiteness as part of the problem. And we want to be able to stand in that, our responsibility around that, without being triggered about white identity. We want to be able to dismantle any kind of attachment to that in a way that won't send us into some kind of a fragile rabbit hole, but will allow us to stand in partnership, in co-conspiratorship, with abolishing all the practices that created that economic hierarchy. And hopefully I'm still not muted. So what kinds of practices, institutional practices, infrastructure is being built to accommodate that, tearing down white privilege, breaking up attachment to worldviews that are false and misrepresentations of our real connections to each other, our interdependence. When I was in college, I was haunted by a statistic, which I'm not sure if it was true. I knew something close to it was true, but the statistic was that 40,000 children died a day from hunger. Today they say something like, it's something like 3 children die every 10 seconds. And what does that have to do with social work in Madison, Wisconsin? You know, that's one of the questions we're trying to get to. You know, what does the production of knowledge in the School of Social Work and the practices that are devised to do social work, what do those conversations have to do with suffering halfway around the world? What is that imprint of white supremacist culture? And it's not enough to just understand that this suffering is actually happening. But I want to know, what is my role in the production of knowledge that ignores that suffering, in the enactment of practices that perpetuate that suffering? I want to understand. So I want to invite you all to take a good upright position in your seats. And if you have a meditation cushion and you want to sit on that, feel free to do that. And then, you know, take your time, just have your feet planted on the ground and facing forward. You have a nice lap. Have your hands palms down on your thighs. Have an upright back with your spine elongated and pointed to the sky. Let your shoulders fall. Let your face relax, your jaw relax. Feel your bottom on your seat. And take a minute to do that. And have your eyes open with a soft downward gaze. Connect with your breath. Feel your breath in your body. And when thoughts rush in, just notice, let them go, and come back to the breath. And the basic view here is that we are giving ourselves space to settle, to slow down, quiet, to allow ourselves to actually be. And by doing that, some sense of friendliness and openness to our human experience is cultivated. So every time thoughts come and take us away from this practice of being with our breath, we're going to let that go and come back to the connected feeling of being in your body and feeling yourself breathe. Let's try this for about 3 or 4 minutes. Thank you so much for trying that with me. We're very much connected to each other. And the things that we do in our day-to-day lives have impact and implications for people beyond us, right? People outside of our immediate experience. But one of the things that happens in a culture that is kind of toxic with individualism is that we forget how connected we are and how much what we do matters and has impacts for other people beyond us. It's one of the reasons why it's so hard to see, challenge, and dismantle privilege. That's over there, and it's not me over here. But the fragility of the planet we're living on, the delicacy, the diversity, the way all of our lives are interwoven is something that we need to recover so that we can take care of each other. And that kind of care has always been a part of how societies survive and move forward. It hasn't been relegated to the field of social work, but you can see some really interesting overlap there, right? That interconnectedness should allow us to pay more attention to who we're listening to. Which wisdom lineages inform how we go about our practice. Unfortunately, it tends to be quite exclusive. Those names we listed at the top of the program fall off the page, fall out of view, aren't being centered and lifted and put into the place that they need to be put. Centered, heard, understood, and utilized. So who are we listening to? And what kinds of hierarchies tell us that we can exclude those voices, the voices of Black feminist thought, the voices of indigenous knowledge? Some of the foundations of privilege are being eroded by just new realities. We're seeing more of how the society we thought we were living in is actually not what we thought. Some people, they're looking at the attempted coup and, they're storming the United States Capitol and going, what, really here? This is something that we've supported all over the world, coups. We're looking at year-round forest fire seasons where, things are on fire all year now. We're looking at millions and millions of miles of glacier melting. All of these things point to our interdependence. They point to the fact that there aren't any isolated entities that don't need others to survive. That's a myth. It's American isolationism, it's individualism, it's privilege and entitlement, and it's ignorance. So what does that have to do with contemplative practice? So I would love it to hear back from you some of the things you're thinking about this exercise we just did and this question about our interdependence. What does it have to do with, what does white supremacist culture and the identities that we're being asked to adopt and the knowledges that we're asked to perpetuate have to do with contemplative practice?
Dr. Brown, while folks are considering that, could I just ask 2 practical questions
Sure.
that came through the Q&A?
Yep.
One, would you be able to share your pronouns with everyone?
No, I don't find it necessary.
Okay, thank you so much.
And I won't be offended.
Okay, thank you. And there were many questions. Everyone seemed to love the poem that you shared in the beginning. And we know that it's by Christos, but could you share the title again, and we'll be able to put that in the chat.
Into a Racism Workshop.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think
Is
that
anybody
folks-
exploring the relationship between doing this work and contemplative practice?
yes, so there are, I was just going to say that if folks could put in their answers to the Q&A, we'll be able to read those out. Somebody said, I'm thinking this is legit thought, seriously important questions. It brings us to a closer understanding of ourselves and the world. Contemplative practices allow the facilitation of healing and create space for people to dialogue with each other. That video was excellent. We're in a web of meaning. The production of scientific knowledge for the sake of its production, while others are living in the now in pain of poverty, is so frustrating. Interconnection. The exercise explores a deeper dive of self and your own biases, something bigger than yourself. I see it as being crucial. Calming the mind allows us to access our true self and power. We need to settle to tap into the wisdom of our interconnectedness.
That's good. That's good. We can say more later if you want, but yeah, I mean, we're getting to that place, understanding that, you know, to know what we don't know, to know what we're buying into, what kind of mythologies and ideologies that don't serve any kind of a liberation practice that can move us beyond white supremacist culture. You know, in order to examine that, we have to make a friend of our own minds, our own critical practice. We don't want to imitate. We want to be genuine. We want to come from a space of conviction that comes out of our own identity. And so we're crafting a revolutionary, liberation, abolition identity, not because of some ideology we read, but because we're connecting it to our own experience. We're connecting it to how we treat each other. We're connecting it, and we can do that because we're looking at how we treat ourselves. We're looking at our relationship with our own being alive, our own human dignity. What is that foundation made of? That's the genuine role that we can play in recrafting an identity that does not rely on white supremacist culture, that is not normalizing disparity, dominance, raping the earth, exploiting the labor of Black and brown people, incarcerating children. And social work helps with all of these things. So if we want to understand our imprint, if we want to understand our experience in relationship to the world we're creating, we're contributing to, we have to break through whatever fear we have, whatever self-deception we have about who and what we are and what we're being asked to participate in. That has to be an independent act, something you do with yourself, with your mind, and your reflections. How you deal with your life, your mind, your world. And then those connections can be genuine. They won't be appropriating somebody else's culture. They won't be running from who you are. They won't be believing in this myth of national borders, all of which were created by violence. And that created our national identity. And that created our racial identity. And those are all lies. But we need to understand the pathways by which we invest in these mistruths. And then truth can become possible. We can know what we don't know. We can break through our own ignorance, and we can wake up. We can grow up. We can be unapologetically pro-Black liberation. So that internal examination has to be the foundation by which we understand what it is we're doing in our day-to-day lives. The mechanization, the bureaucratization of participation in a death machine. It is all made palatable. We can swallow it. The pill-sized form that we can swallow is some concept, some term, some norm that allows us to separate ourselves from each other. So we cannot understand the impact, the imprint of our own day-to-day actions in perpetuating harm. From the restorative perspective, interdependence is extremely important. Accountability is extremely important. Repairing harm, extremely important. You cannot do that without that reflective piece, that ability to go inside, and that willingness, that bravery to break through the self-deception that is a part of the identity we've crafted or that we've accepted. Identities associated and invested in white supremacist culture. And that path looks different for everybody. You know, everybody's going to do something different with that. But that's an important foundation, right? So that's the very personal and interpersonal level by which we can build some foundation for interrupting institutional harm and the institutional practices that we're being groomed to participate in. And we really should take that idea of being groomed seriously. You know, how we're taught to see things a certain way so that our participation can be enlisted. Okay. So somebody mentioned Bettina Love earlier, and I wanted to share something from her that allows us to kind of put into the framework of what professional practice can do to create, you know, the acceptability of complicity, the acceptability of silence, and the willing into again and again into this slumber that does not look and see and examine, you know, the diversity of wisdom lineages that really are what we should be listening to. You know, if something is not being, if an answer is not coming, if an awareness of how to break out of white supremacist culture is not readily apparent, we just need to be more curious about what that looks like. So I'm going to read several paragraphs here, and then we're going to do a contemplation based on one line from this reading. Okay, buckle up. How much time do I have? I think I have 35 minutes, so I think we're good.
That's right, 35 minutes, maybe a few minutes at the end to address some questions.
Absolutely, and we'll after this, and we'll do the contemplation, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Perfect, thank you so much, Dr. Brown.
So Dr. Love is talking about abolitionism within the context of schools. But any profession and all the institutions in our society are invested with the same kinds of institutional practices that are the remnants of, you know, a society that was built on violence and theft and rape and enslavement and genocide. So all of these things apply to every institution in our culture. So I'm gonna use this one, but you know, it's very translatable. It is not by chance or good fortune that top-level staff at nonprofits and charter schools are overwhelmingly white people serving dark populations who deserve more than a 5-year strategic plan of dreams of saving all the less fortunate. Dark families deserve to have a right to the power of the organization that seeks to determine what is the right course of action for their lives. Meaning the decision-making, the budget, the staff, the overall goals should be made in conjunction with the community and with the analysis of whiteness, racism, sexism, homophobia, and neoliberalism. All the decisions we make must be guided by our moral compass of intersectional social justice. Where we choose to live, teach, send our kids to school, work, go to the movies, dine, and attend college, as well as the TV shows we watch, the clothes we buy, and even where we buy goods can all be traced back to race, racism, whiteness, classism, sexuality, gender, and whose land we're living on. If our everyday, repetitive, mundane life decisions are made by racism, whiteness, and sexism, then so are our curriculums, discipline policies, teacher hiring practices, school closing decisions, testing, teacher pay, teacher turnover, and school leaders. The struggle for educational freedom does not somehow vanish when you apply theory, but your barriers are no longer hiding in plain sight. Now you have the language, understanding, and hopefully co-conspirators not only to fight, but also to demand what is needed to thrive. Understanding theory does not mean you live an oppressive life. It means you have a deep understanding of oppression and how it works structurally. However, what you are learning about are people's real lives. You theorize it while some people live it. I often conduct workshops on racism and white supremacy, topics that make many of my participants uncomfortable. I remind them that it's okay to be uncomfortable, but also to understand that while you may be uncomfortable for 45 minutes, other people are uncomfortable their entire lives dealing with oppression. Theory explains what we see. It can make whiteness glasses from our eyes. It can take the whiteness glasses from our eyes. And this is very much about looking at that worldview, that framework for consciousness, and taking it apart so that we can know what we don't know, taking off those whiteness glasses. So the contemplation that I want you guys to engage with me is one sentence from this. So you can take your meditation practice, your meditation posture, and instead of focusing on the breath, though, we're going to come back again and again to this line from this quote. And your job is to take this line and connect with it. First, at a conceptual level, you're trying to understand it, your own understanding of it. Then from a perspective of a felt sense, where does it land in your body? How does the truth of it arise for you? And that can be a very unique experience of what's being written, what's being shared here. So again and again, when you feel like you're moving away from being completely present, you just come back to the quote itself. All the decisions we make must be guided by our moral compass of intersectional social justice. Let's contemplate that. All of the decisions we make must be guided by our moral compass of intersectional social justice. Okay. Thank you all for contemplating that. Now, if you have questions, concerns, things you want to raise, I'm especially interested to hear about where this lands for you. We're all invested in something where we're being asked to be complicit in something, to perpetuate something. And this is asking, and then Bettina is telling us, so how are we going to navigate that? What is the moral responsibility? What is the intersectionality there? What is the social justice issue there that we need to be investigating and acting on? Okay, if you would mind reading any of the comments or questions, if people have questions or things like that, please share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. There are several questions that came in that I'll read out for everyone. The first is, thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for this unapologetic workshop. How can and must we hold one another accountable, understanding accountability as an act of love in that critical self-reflection process? How can we support this process in one another while not perpetuating these deathful legacies?
I like deathful legacies, that's good. How can we support each other? What's the other part of that?
How do we hold each other accountable?
Well, the first point of accountability is ourself. I think a lot is made of holding each other accountable. But when you're in the room with somebody who's being racist, you're really looking in the mirror, right? So like we're all over Donald Trump right now, right? But there's a little Donald Trump in all of us. I'm not trying to minimize the horrors that this man has brought upon us. But let's try not to separate ourselves by holding each other accountable. Let's make sure we're living that thing we're trying to teach. Because a lot of times what will happen, especially with middle-class white folks, is they'll be like, well, my dad, my God, I voted for Biden, but my dad, and obviously it goes way beyond politics, but, we have to stop doing that, right? So the first point of accountability is like, how am I going to hold myself accountable? And if I'm completely accountable for everything that my imprint, I'm going to find some gentleness for this person's ignorance. Right? Because what we want from that person when we're holding them accountable is to connect with them, engage with them as human beings and recognize their dignity and understanding and listen to understand them. But if you're busy holding them accountable, you might be trying to do something else. Right? We're trying to do something else. We're trying to do something else. We're calling each other in. We're understanding what we've inherited that contributes to our ignorance. And we're trying to move out of it. And we don't want to shut that person down. We don't want to send them, we want them to engage us. We want them to feel safe to be open and honest with who they are. So that's something we have to remember when we're being accountable to ourselves and with each other, is what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to accomplish reconnection with the human community, with our human dignity, with the basic human sanity we're all born with. We want to point each other back to that. And we can help each other that way. And it's not some definition that came from some social work book, right? That came from you looking inside and you find your own wisdom lineage that way. It's not going to come out of a book. You're going to sit with your grandmother. She's a wise old lady. I don't care who she is. Right?
There's another question related to something that I just heard you say, Dr. Brown, which is about calling out versus calling in, especially within organizational structures, and your thoughts about balancing calling out versus calling in.
Well, when it comes to the institution you guys are working in, you really need to organize, right? Calling out is not going to be enough. You really need to decide, you need to do what Dr. Love uses Robin D.J. Kelly's, RDJ Kelly's idea of freedom dreaming. You need to get serious about whether or not you're bullshitting or you're performing, or you really want to change what social work is doing. It's causing harm. You know, it's locking up our kids. Right? Do you want to be a part of that death reality? Or I don't know the phrase the person used earlier was
Deathful legacies.
You want to be a part of that deathful legacy? Thank you. Or do you want to look at social work and say, what could it be besides this? That takes organizing. Don't call them in or call them out. Sit down together and decide what you want. You can actually transform that institution to make it what it could be. It will mean listening to people who aren't there. Most of the people you need to be listening to are not at your campus. They're not in your textbooks. And why have they told you to listen to them instead of the folks like Gil Scott-Heron and Christos? You know, why are you being told to listen to them? Why have you been told to listen to experts instead of yourself? These are the questions you got to get clear with before you can transform social work. Who is it we should be listening to?
There's another question about somewhat related. When an individual empowered doesn't see the need for equity work, what steps should someone take to try to create a narrative and bring about the necessary change in their not-for-profit setting, for example?
Well, let's question this idea of equity work. You know, are we talking about transformative justice, abolitionist justice, or equity work? Equity work, the language of that, if you look at it, everywhere, is not getting the job done. So if you need to call it equity work, do that. But when there's a person in the position of power, a decision maker who's not listening, well, what kinds of other avenues of listening should we create? You know, Buckminster Fuller used to say, you know, I read a quote of his, I love this guy, you know, let's build what we want. And to me, that's really about looking across to each other for leadership. Like this decision maker doesn't understand equity work. Is that the person we want to have the conversation with? You know, at some point, we have to create the alternatives that will replace this guy or this woman or whatever gender fluid identity they would like to use. You know, we want to replace them, but we need to build what we want, right? And let's offer that alternative. Let's say, this is what we want instead. And if we don't get it, we're out of here. But you got to build the alternative, right? You guys, this is what I want. I want social work to stop locking up Black children. And I'm going to investigate all the ways in which we contribute to that. And we're going to create the alternatives. Let's do some freedom dreaming. And we're like, this is what we want instead. And then all of you guys should just walk out. You're just like, well, no, we're tired of there's blood on our hands and we're tired, so we're out. But we gave you a really good alternative, and this is what we're going to be practicing while you're over there doing that bullshit. Okay? So if they don't do it, what are you going to do then? You're like, you ask them, what are you going to do? Can you build something else? The new school, is that the new school? The new school in New York was an alternative, right? The program I came out of was an alternative. Graduate students said, no. What anthropology is doing is oppressive. We're replacing it. So history of consciousness came out of that. Build your own department. You don't have to stick around in this case. Doors open. But there's a lot of privilege there, right? So we got to decide. We got to choose.
Several more questions have come in. There's a participant who would like to know how this work and what you're talking about intersects with religion.
Religion?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could think about this as a spiritual moment. Do you mean that? I mean, because I think religion, as far as, organized religion, I don't really find a correlation there, except that that's another place where we have to dismantle this stuff, right? All these institutions, whether it's the organized church, we could think of this as a spiritual moment. We could think of what we're doing as a spiritually transformative. And I think it is certainly that, but it's also more than that, right? I don't know if I actually answered that question, but I think that that's a very personal thing.
There's another question about your thoughts about the role of community care in an abolitionist future.
Well, I think, if you look at where social work has happened outside of this really narrow definition within your profession, community care is that, right? And so we need to get that acknowledgement. Who's doing this work, and who needs to be empowered to recognize the autonomy that's coming out of Black and brown communities, out of poor communities, out of women's communities, out of children's communities, out of marginalized communities. Where's the autonomy for that role? Where's, how are we acknowledging those voices and that wisdom? The hierarchies where there's this social worker who's othering and pathologizing all of these other communities needs to be broken down entirely, so that you can actually listen to the wisdom of the people that are actually doing this work. My grandmother she could go into the woods and find a root that could heal you, right? Nobody's gonna call her a doctor. And she didn't want to be called a doctor. She was a healer, right? So that's the point. Listen to what needs to be listened to and utilize that. And don't have an allegiance to some bullshit. You have to have your allegiance to what is actually genuine and real, and where that power of the communities that are offering that is acknowledged and brought into the center, right? So centralize your grandmother's wisdom, centralize your ancestors, centralize the spontaneity coming out of this very moment. And that may not look like what you're being taught. That's community care, that's listening to the right people. So that's what we need to recenter. That's the way I look at this.
Dr. Brown, we are just almost at time, but there was one request for you to reread the quote that you shared before, just before the Q&A. And I thought that would be a beautiful way to end.
Well, I want to say something about sanity first.
Of course.
How many minutes do I have?
1.
Okay, I mentioned the sanity that we're born with. What our contemplative practice and what our, socially just practice can do is point us to that. And we can cultivate that. We can cultivate a loyalty to that basic human sanity. We can trust that. We can come back to that. We can use that. We can build that basic human sanity. There's nothing Freudian about it. None of the psychoanalytic theorists talk about it. And yet that's what we need to get back to. All the decisions we make must be guided by our moral compass, our intersectional social justice. One more time. All the decisions we make must be guided by our moral compass of intersectional social justice.
Dr. Brown, we can't thank you enough for sharing your time, your passion, your expertise with us. Thank you everyone for attending. and your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. Again, for those of you who are seeking CEUs, you will receive an email in the coming weeks with the certificate, and the link to our closing panel is in the chat. And if you would like to join us, we encourage you to do so, and there will be more from Dr. Brown at that point. Thank you all so much for coming, and we hope to see you at the closing panel. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. What an absolute privilege.